Good afternoon, everyone. For those joining us for this part of our program today, we want to welcome you to day 2 of the National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators 2021 spring meeting, focusing on some of the most pressing issues for the Hispanic community. My name is Kenneth Romero. I'm the Executive Director at the National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators, and I'm also the Chair of the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda, which is the coalition of the 45 most important Hispanic organizations in the nation. This afternoon's forum will focus on fighting the wave of voter disenfranchisement bills that we're seeing throughout the entire nation. We are joined by former state legislator, a minority leader of the Georgia House of Representatives, and founder of Fair Fight Action, Stacey Abrams, and the president of NHCSL, New Mexico Senator Danny Ivy Soto. Stacey, welcome to our forum.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we start with questions that we have regarding all of these disenfranchisement bill, we would like to ask you to address a few remarks, introductory remarks to our members.
Thank you. And thank you again to Senator Ivy, to all of you for having me here today. As you know, we are facing an onslaught. 48 states, more than 400 bills have been introduced, not simply to respond to the 2020 election outcome, but to respond to the 2020 election's participation. This is not an issue of who won or who lost. It was about who was heard. And sadly, for too many of our fellow Americans, they consider an inconvenience, an atrocity to have occurred when so many voters from so many communities, especially from the Hispanic community, stood up and made their voices heard. We know that the outcome of these elections did not necessarily reshape politics at the local level, at the state level, but what they are seeing is a surge of engagement and investment, a surge of participation that should be celebrated. This is a conversation about patriotism. Who will be heard, who will shape the future of our nation? But instead of celebration, and to the extent we need to, accommodation of these changes, we are instead seeing a retrenchment and a restoration of the insurrection that started on January 6th. Across this country, we are seeing a concerted effort to roll back access, to block participation, and to undermine our elections. And it's happening in 3 ways. Number one, it's the anti-voter legislation. And let us be very clear. There is no conversation that is legitimate about voter fraud in this last election. There is no concern that we have too many people participating unlawfully. Those are not things that occurred, and those are certainly not things that should be responded to. But what is being responded to is the surge of voter participation across communities that typically didn't believe their voices could be heard. And so instead of addressing and encouraging their participation by using the new tools and the new technologies that manifested themselves during the pandemic, we are instead seeing the pandemic choices being rolled back, and even going further to go back to just before the Voting Rights Act was made real. We are seeing a return to, as I describe it, Jim Crow 2.0. Now, there are those who would push back and say that nothing can be as vile as that time, but let's be clear. When we talk about what Jim Crow was, Jim Crow for voting rights never once mentioned the race of voters. It was precluded by the 15th Amendment. And so instead of targeting voters by race, they targeted voters by behavior, and they exempted voters whose grandfathers could have voted in the Civil War. And it became very clear and very obvious who was under attack. What did they tackle? They tackled literacy. They tackled access. They tackled the ability to pay. And what we are seeing become law across this country are things that once again challenge who can participate. When you see the removal of drop boxes and the limits on hours for voting, that's a direct economic impact on those who do not have the convenience of a Tuesday in November to turn up and vote. When you see new rules for providing documentation, this is not about proving who you are. It's about limiting the number of ways you can demonstrate your right to participate in our elections, which should be a repugnant notion to anyone who is an American. This anti-voter legislation seeks to restrict who can register and how they can vote and if their votes get counted. But second to that, and at the exact same time that these bills are focusing on anti-voter legislation, they're also attacking our election workers, those who give their time and their talent to make certain our democracy works at the most fundamental administrative level. From states like Texas and Georgia to Arizona and Florida and parts north, we are seeing attacks on election workers, trying to make them the villains in this piece. People who do nothing but try to make certain our voices get counted are instead being attacked, are being vilified, are being villainized, and are being intimidated by these laws. And in the worst examples, their actions are being criminalized, because the hope is that if it's too hard to do the job, they will not help voters who need their assistance the most. Anti-voter legislation, anti-election worker legislation, but third and most troubling is subversion of democracy legislation. Bills that are attempting to allow state legislators and others to overturn the will of the people, not because of fraud, not because of malfeasance, but because of inconvenience. That should be untenable to any American. That should be untenable to anyone who purports to believe in our system of government. Each of us comes to this space having chosen a party alliance, and that is entirely our opportunity. But we are first and foremost Americans. And the attack on the right to vote is not an attack of partisanship. It is an attack on our citizenship. It is something that we should reject. It is something that we should revile, and it is something we should defeat. And that is why I am proud to be working in solidarity across the country with people of every political stripe to defend our democracy, because our right to vote is our right to defend the nature of who we are and to plan the futures we deserve. And so I'm excited to be here today with you to discuss how we can get this done.
Ms. Abrams, thank you so very much for those introductory comments. And let me just go right into a couple of questions, because there's so much we need to cover. The 2020 election was truly remarkable for so many reasons, but the biggest probably was turnout. And when it comes to turnout of people of color, despite all the barriers, your team receives much of the credit, especially in Georgia. How did you do it?
Well, first of all, we understood that the right to vote and the impediments to the right to vote do not simply exist in Georgia. While we were a singular example of voter suppression, we were not the only ones. And the work that Fair Fight began in Georgia actually spread to 20 states in the 2020 election. We actually started in August of 2019. And what we did was work in every state where we operated to help shore up the capacity of existing workers, of existing organizations, of infrastructure that had unfortunately been under-resourced and undervalued. The most important part of protecting our elections is understanding the administration of those elections, not worrying so much about who's running for office, but who's running the process. And by focusing on those infrastructure issues, we were able to help mitigate voter suppression across the country. But I do want to amplify one piece. And there is this fallacy that keeps being repeated, this notion that voter suppression cannot coexist with voter turnout. That's like saying that because there are more people in the water, there are no longer any sharks. That's not how nature works. That's not how suppression works. But we do know that the best mitigation of voter suppression is increased turnout. And that's what worked so effectively. Talking to voters, engaging them, and making certain that when they decided to use their power to vote, their power was actually made real.
Well, and as the former state election director in my state of New Mexico, this is an issue I've worked on for many, many years. But even with record turnout among Hispanics, our communities still have the most upside potential in terms of turnout. Our activists are continually debating how to achieve this. Now, you're not Hispanic, as far as I know, but you have deep experience in this area. So how do you think we should look? What areas should we look for and focus on as we work on this?
The first responsibility is for us to be honest about what voting is and what it's not. Voting is not magic. And for communities that have faced either the specter of disinformation or the specter of real undervalued participation, they do not believe that voting is going to create change. And we have to be honest that voting itself does not create change. It is not magic, it is medicine. And it's having that constant conversation that says that if you had any other illness, the illness of poverty, the disease of racism, the disease of discrimination, disease of lack of access, that those things are best treated by a constant application of the right to vote, because that's how we elect the leaders who reflect our needs and answer to our challenges. So first, it's being honest about what's happening. Second, it's being thoughtful about what the impediments are. For those who come from civically engaged communities, there's a bit of naivete about how hard it can be to vote. And so one of the most important facets to voter engagement is actually dismantling those systems that make it harder to participate. If this is something that's not number 1 or 2 on your list of things to do, the first time you run into a roadblock, especially if you're suspicious, you're going to sit down. And what is so important about engaging the Latino community, the Hispanic community, and what so many great organizations are doing is they're getting to the root causes. They're getting to those blocks and those stumbles. But the last piece is that we cannot wait for elections to talk about voting. We treat it as an event. It is not an event, it's a process. And so if we only wait until there's an election to talk about it, then it's crowded out by other conversations. But if we do it year round, if we do the work that this organization is doing and talk about it when it's not top of mind, we create a culture of participation that has to be done with cultural competency, with geographic relevance, and with a very fine attention to the issues that matter in those communities.
So let's pivot over to the issue of criminal disenfranchisement. Only the District of Columbia, Maine, Puerto Rico, and Vermont have no criminal disenfranchisement law. And with the mass incarceration and other racial and ethnic biases of the criminal justice system, the impact of this on people of color becomes evident. The Brennan Center also estimates that beyond how complicated some state laws are, there's persistent confusion among election officials, at the local level particularly, who receive little or no training on these laws. And there's little or no coordination or communication between election offices and the criminal justice system. Georgia restores voting rights upon completing the sentence, including parole and probation, in much the same way as my state of New Mexico does. Do you find that many potential voters had simply been illegally denied access to registration?
Well, it's a combination of being illegally denied and being unfortunately given poor information. So in the state of Georgia, you are entitled to restoration upon completion, but it is not an automated process, which means we put the onus on the people who are the least likely to have agency to determine what these systems demand. And because it's administered not at a central location by one of 50, but instead by one of 159 counties, you leave it to the person who is the least likely to know the process to try to discern how to navigate a bureaucracy that is designed to keep them outside. And so one of the reasons that we have to address this illegal behavior, and I would say that in some cases it's intentionally illegal, in other cases it's either woeful ignorance or intentional ignorance, we have to respond by putting the responsibility on the lawmakers and on the bureaucracy to restore the vote, not on our returning citizens. We know that as a fundamental matter, when you have your rights restored, you are less likely to recidivate. You are more likely to be engaged in community, and you are more likely to achieve success. There is a fundamental good in restoring the rights of our returning citizens. There is a cost to criminal disenfranchisement, and there should be a cost to those who continue to perpetuate and persist in denying access to the right to vote.
So since the last election, and as of, I think, May 14th of this year, legislators had introduced, I believe, 389 different bills with voting restrictions provisions in 48 different states. 14 states have already enacted 22 laws with restrictive provisions, and at least 61 bills with restrictive provisions in 18 states are moving through legislatures. 31 have passed at least one chamber, while another 30 have had some sort of committee action. Many of our Texas members blocked one of those bills at the end of their session by walking out of the building, breaking quorum as they were adjourning for the year. How do we fight this wave? They're going to get called back into special session. other legislatures are working on other things. How do we fight this wave of disenfranchisement?
We have to do three things. One is that we have to keep lifting up the assault on our right to vote. And I celebrate and applaud what was done by the Texas Democrats. Just yesterday, I think it was, the Texas House Republicans acknowledged that there was a part of the bill that would have allowed them to overturn elections without proof of fraud. And they decried that that was in the bill. They didn't know it was in that bill. Had that bill moved with the speed, with the alacrity, and with the lack of attention that would have happened but for those Texas Democrats, but for the members of this caucus, that bill would have become the law of the land in Texas, which would have allowed the overturning of elections from the presidency all the way down to a local school board member. And that should be untenable. And so our first responsibility is to keep talking about it. As we all know, I'm a former state legislator, as state legislatures, we know that our work often happens not only in the shadows, but out of mind. And by lifting up what's happening at the state level, we are creating a zeitgeist where people start to understand that their right to vote is really under attack. As long as it sounds hyperbolic, they're not going to pay attention. But when their local legislators, when those men and women who serve them talk about what's happening at the state level, it becomes real. It becomes concretized. Number two, we have to advocate for federal action. Every one of us in the states understand that we can do what we want, but the preemption that can come from the federal government is often something we worry about. But this is one case where it's not about preemption. It is about unification. It is about setting a standard for democracy so that geography doesn't determine the quality of your citizenship. And we have to be strong proponents of the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And that's why Fair Fight has created Hot Call Summer to encourage reaching out to our U.S. senators, all 100 of them, regardless of where they believe they stand. We have the responsibility to tell them where we think they should stand. And then third, we have to support the organizations doing the work of mitigating these bills. Because the reality is, as you said, the Texas bill is coming back. And in those states where those bills are in action, we have to be on the ground, engaging community, making certain people know what's in those bills, what harm it will wreak, but also the power they have. Because 2022 is not just an election year at the top of the ticket. Almost every state legislative body is going to face some type of election, and they should understand there are consequences for not serving the people.
So despite all these challenges, you seem like a happy warrior in many ways. Certainly someone who is indefatigable in terms of your energy. What's your secret?
I am the granddaughter. I was doing some research recently. I knew my grandfather was older than my grandmother. I did not realize my grandfather was born in 1887. He was born 20 years after the end of slavery. And yet in 2 generations, I had the extraordinary opportunity to stand for governor, to become the first Black woman in American history to be the nominee of my party to become governor. My resilience comes from knowing that I am the legacy of not only his legacy, I'm the legacy of his parents and my great-great-grandparents, but I'm also a promise of what can come. And we don't have the luxury of fatigue. We don't have the luxury of cessation. We have the obligation to fight for this nation we believe in. I never joined the military. Instead, my service has been done through public service. And my responsibility then is to keep pushing, to hold our nation accountable for its highest ideals, and to do so in coalition and in community. I was honored to be invited to have this conversation with you because I've tried my best during my tenure in the legislature in Georgia to build a caucus that looked like Georgia, to invest in communities other than my own, because we are together, because diversity is our strength. And because when we rise together, when we invest together, we can get good done. I am indefatigable because I know that we saw record turnout across the board, especially among the Hispanic community in Georgia. And that gives me hope that we can get even more done the next day and the day after that and the day after that.
Well, I serve as a state senator in New Mexico. My mother is Cuban, but my father was born in Georgia. And as a child, I lived in Covington. And so, I really appreciate the work that you were doing, not just in Georgia, but throughout the entire country right now. And NHCSL stands to work with you as Fair Fight continues to keep the fight fair so the voters can truly make a choice.
Thank you so much.
Stacey Abrams, thank you so much for joining us today.
Take care.
Very well. You too. We now move to the panel discussion on disenfranchisement bills. So let us turn it over to Hector Sanchez Barba to take us into that panel discussion. Hector.
Thank you, and thank you to you, and thank you to Kenneth for the invitation to participate in this important discussion, a discussion that is so critical for the nation, and in particular for the Latino community. Everything that you do as a legislator, everything that we fight for is directly related to this issue. I've been working on policy issues in Washington, D.C. for almost more than 20 years on every single policy issue with NHLA or with Blackline Labor or with Mi Familia Vota or with immigrant rights groups. And every single policy issue that we're fighting for, we are at the very bottom, or we are the group that is being excluded, or we are the group that has been fighting for decades to even get the basics of basic immigration reform. And unless we get the power that we deserve as a community, we are gonna continue being the most vulnerable workers in the nation, the most vulnerable community in the nation, the most excluded community in the nation with other minorities. And this is why the conversation that we're having today is so critical and so important, because if we want to advance all the policy issues that all of you as legislators work on, it's important that we use this political power that we have in community to create accountability, to push in the communities, to make sure that the politicians are doing what is right for our nation and for all of our communities. We must stop the extremism that we are seeing, not only in the last election, but the growing extremism in different spaces and communities. So that's why this is so important. To Stacey Abrams, Ms. Abrams, what an inspiration to see you being in the front lines, to see you reminding us why this conversation is an important conversation. We cannot go back to the medieval ages of total exclusion of minorities, total exclusion of women, total exclusion of African-American communities, Latino communities, Native American communities, Asian communities. And you are a reminder of what we have done as a nation, people that have been paving the way for all of us to be here. And we need to keep fighting. You say, and I really like what you say, we don't have the luxury of fatigue. And this is why the people that we have today speaking about this important issue are so critical and important. But let me introduce myself first. My name is Hector Sanchez Barba. I'm the CEO and Executive Director of Mi Familia Vota. We are a national organization that fully focuses on creating Latino political power and civic participation. We have 14 offices in 6 states, and last year we expanded our operation to 10 states because of the importance and critical election. We are recognized because of our field operations. Last year we had one of the largest field operations in the nation, really doing all the work. Usually we do voter registration, GOTV, border education, citizenship. We work on COVID issues and any other issues that are central for our communities. But today, we have some of the most amazing voices in the nation in the front lines, not only fighting border suppression, but really empowering our communities in all the different issues that we are fighting for. And the panelists that we have is Ellen Bochman, President of the Opportunity Agenda, Lidia Camarillo, President of Southwest Border Registration, Maria Teresa Kumar, CEO and President of Voto Latino, and Jorge Vasquez, Program Director of Power and Democracy at the Advancement Project. Let me start with you, Ellen. We have been collaborating and we have been working for a while on these amazing issues of everything that deals with civil rights, workers' rights, and obviously voting rights, a critical issue that we are facing right now. Because if there is something that I can think of all of you that I see in this screen, is that day to day, we're working so hard to make sure that our people have access to democracy, to make sure that we're doing the voter registration, that we're educating, that we're fighting all the misinformation, etc. And then after this important election, when our community comes out in historical numbers, we have all these politicians, anti-democratic politicians, anti-democracy pushing from this perspective. So that is why this is so important. But Ellen, as a leading expert on civil rights messaging, your insight into how legislators, lawyers, and organizers approach this is critical to get support from people to fight disinformation. What suggestions do you have for the legislators that we have on our call today about what to do, about some of the strategic elements of moving forward, and what resources should they be using at this moment?
Thank you so much, Hector. It's wonderful to see you. It's wonderful to be among friends and family. It's been quite a long time. Even in a small box, y'all look great. I hope everybody is safe. I hope everyone is healthy. And first, I want to start with giving you the good wishes for your weekend. And I hope it's restorative too. Let me also say thank you to the wonderful, amazing team here at NHCSL. You all have done yeoman's work, talk about on the front lines. I'm going to lift up Mr. Anchia in a minute because he's actually giving us a lot of evidence of the things to do that I'm only going to underscore and by no means take credit for. I'm only going to underscore some things that he's done. Let me back up though and let y'all know a little bit about us and also invite you to contact any member of the Opportunity Agenda team at opportunityagenda.org for open source training, open source research, open source message development and guidance, and open source narrative suggestions. The Opportunity Agenda is what we believe to be a social and racial justice communication lab. And the word lab sometimes confuses people, so I will share that what that's referring to, friends, is we are constantly learning, Hector, how to deal with the question that you were asking me today in this context. And we're doing that through, as I said, constantly researching and learning, implementing, working with social and racial justice leaders, and testing, and then backing up and figuring out again, because we all know that oftentimes the first time doesn't sometimes hit the mark. And we again invite you all to join us in this effort. Now, for myself, as part of the introduction, it's important to say too that I know many of you from a previous hat. I spent 15 years at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and I worked in partnership with the Opportunity Agenda in that context on these issues. And that's really kind of why I think today I am most honored, because it's that connective tissue and that collaborative spirit that is both in my DNA and calls on all of us. And Stacey Abrams said it best. And Stacey, thank you. Making certain that we are calling out the question that is both out of principle and incorrect, and making sure that our people are encouraged to vote and participate is 100% the bedrock of our democracy. So now to your question, because I know we have a big discussion and I don't want to take up too much of your time. There are three things that the Opportunity Agenda wants to make sure that we communicate about this question. How do we fight back? And how do we make sure that our messages get across? Remember that our organization is working on the long-term story, the narrative, the conversation that we want to aspire to, right? It's not only, and this is point number one, about the short-term message around the legislative effort that you as legislators, formidable legislators, are trying to engage in. It is also about the story that you want to see in your community that you are trying to achieve. And that's narrative. Narrative is that big story. We all walk around with it in our heads. Sometimes it's multiple narratives all at once that conflict with one another. And sometimes our opponents are exploiting the heck out of that. Think about how well they're doing with exploiting the big lie, as Stacey said. So with that in mind, the three things that I would recommend are as follows. And I would also submit to you that these are things that I know you know. And these are things that work. So let's make sure to commit to doing this. One, making sure to center those who are most directly impacted in the story that we are trying to tell. What do we mean by that? You know, as somebody who is partnering with folks in communities of color and racial and social justice organizations, with anyone who shares our values, it is important that I, not as an ally, but as someone said at an event that I was at yesterday, as an accomplice, that I am making sure as that accomplice, I am working with you, Hector, so that your story about why people who look like you should be given the opportunity to participate in the fabric of our democracy. And that goes to the aspirational story, which is the second point. One of the questions that I often get asked, and this is part of your question, is how can lawyers and legislators be more equipped to tell the story of what they're trying to achieve? Well, the first thing that I would say to you is many of you will always be the smartest person in the room with respect to what you're trying to do. However, the values around why you are the smartest person in the room, and I'm not just trying to be funny here, the values that you are putting forth in terms of everyone counting, everyone's voice being heard, everyone being a part of our democracy, everyone, regardless of the color of their skin, being counting in our democracy, as I said, really important. Don't spend too much time getting mired in the problem. Don't spend too much time talking about the legalese. Don't spend too much time talking about, yes, the big lie. Why? Because think about what happens to you when you're surrounded by people who are constantly doing that. You turn off, and worse yet, you don't think you can be a part of the solution, right? Which is why it's so important to really think about what is the aspirational story that you're trying to tell, and how can you convey that strictly in values language. It's really important to start with values. Values is the honey that attracts people. Values is what makes us effective communicators. Values is the invitation that people need to join us. And if that's the goal, which it always is, then we need to make sure that we hearken back to those values. And the third thing, and this is where Mr. Anchia did such an amazing job, and we have a slide that we can't share for some reason, but I'm going to talk about it in a second and refer to a resource that we actually have in the packet that we shared with the staff here as well. But the third thing that is really important to underscore, friends, and I've been guilty of not doing this too, don't ever let yourself not share the action that you're asking people to take, right? It's so important to share how people can come along with you by giving them a simple action. I don't know, my colleague Zay may be able to share her screen now. Hector, it's only one slide, if it's possible to do that. If not, I'm just going to talk about it, and this is what I'm going to close on because it's a resource, and I know that I was supposed to talk about that too. The opportunity agenda has a formula for doing the three things that I just described. We call it VPSA. Thank you, Zay. What is the value you're trying to convey? What is the problem that is impeding that value from coming across? What is the solution, the legislation, or the legislation that you want to defeat? And what is the action that you are urging people to take? As you can see, I took Mr. Anchia, and thank you if you are participating, for everything that you did. And I also want to tip my hat to that Democratic caucus in Texas. Thank you, all of you, for your courage and your leadership. But to the point here, this is our resource number one, which you can find on opportunityagenda.org. You can find tools that can help you create your VPSA, as we say, for what it is you are trying to talk about. So here, as you can see, we must promote and protect the rights and the votes of all Texans, regardless of the color of their skin. But Senate Bill 7 perpetuates the big lie that the 2020 election was stolen by people of color. And as Stacey Abrams says, that is a point that we need to make sure that we push people to reckon with. We can't here, however, spend too much time on the problem. Really important not to get again into that myriad of problems and turn people off, to pivot to the solution. And as Mr. Anchia put it, as members, we've got to rise to make good trouble, a tribute to my hero, John Lewis, and we need to make sure we defend the vote. So rise against the big lie and take the action, oppose Senate Bill 7, and join in voting no. You can unshare your screen now, Zay. The VPSA is really where it's at for us as our number one tool. We also have research that backs up this formula. We have message guidance that will help you, and tips like, you know what, people don't know what voter suppression means, but they do know what obstacles to vote mean. So language like that really, really matters. And we also have ways that we train folks to be able to practice, because if the words are not comfortable in the mouths of people, then why recommend it in the first place? I'm going to leave it there, Hector. There's a lot more that I could say, as you probably know. Thank you so much for your leadership and your work.
Thank you, amiga, for contextualizing some of the important issues that that we need to have and the resources that are so important for, especially for the legislators and organizers and activists. Now, well, my next question is for my dear amiga Maria Teresa Kumar. Maria Teresa, the pandemic has been obviously very difficult, but I've been with you in this space, having so many conversations. I can't wait to have a cafecito with you in person to catch up.
I thought we were doing tequila. Right.
En otra conversación, amiga.
Now he's changing it. Everyone is tuning in. He had promised me tequila. Right.
You and I come from immigrant backgrounds. You're a Colombian immigrant, a Mexican immigrant. When I have the conversations on democracy with people from Mexico, they really say, is that really how the democracy works in the US? When I talk about some of the voter suppression elements, some of the history of exclusion of minorities, and they're in shock because internationally we are perceived as the perfect democracy. But that's only an element to contextualize how far we are from becoming that perfect democracy and the work that we need to do. And you're a reflection of the work that needs to happen every day, Voto Latino, with having these amazing ideas for younger people on digital, on organizing, on voter registration from a new perspective, on online, etc. So how are you fighting fake news and misinformation that has been discouraging our community, Latinos, from engaging in the political process? And in this particular case that we have so many legislators, how can legislators help, or what do they need to do from their perspective to make this a better and more inclusive democracy?
Hector, thank you so much for the conversation. And I want to thank Ken for including Voto Latino. The work that you do at NHCLSL is not only imperative, but it actually talks about the growing electorate and the power of the Latino community. I want to borrow some of the stuff that Stacy shared with you because I think she was absolutely right. We must not forget that what brought in a different government was a multicultural America rising. It wasn't just one constituency. It was a group of Americans, whether it was because they voted, they volunteered, they registered, they turned out, they protested, they funded. It was a multicultural America saying, this is what our country is and where we want to go. I can speak to the work of Voto Latino, but before we do that, let's remind ourselves the reason why we're here. There is a concentrated group of Americans who just don't like the multicultural America that voted. That rising electorate, that force that happens to coincide with the coming of age of young Latinos. In 2003, Latinos became the second largest demographics in this country, second largest. But it took us 18 years to 2020 for that to be realized as the second largest voting bloc. 18 years. And what happened in those 18 years? In 2010, when the census came out, in quick order, a GOP-led effort at the state houses saw the rising electorate. Shelby County against Eric Holder, that gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, had a 100% increase in Latino births and rise of people, of constituents, not of age, but of babies. And the 22 jurisdictions that followed, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, Colorado, do you see a pattern? Had at least a 22% increase in Latino participation. I'm sorry, had at least a 60% population growth in Latinos, disproportionately young people. Fast forward to what we're seeing at the state Texas legislative state houses and in Georgia, two things are true. First of all, Texas and Georgia, according to Northern Illinois University, are dead last in access to the voting booth already. But what they don't like is that multicultural America rising. In Georgia, what we saw was a rise in young African Americans, young Latinos, and young Asians, creating almost perfect trifecta. The Georgia Secretary of State and the Texas Secretary of State, they both certified state safe, fair elections. There was no reason for these shenanigans of increasing and discouraging participation. And the reason it being is that in Texas alone, by next year, you're going to have 250,000 new eligible Latino youth to vote in the elections. So instead of competing for our vote, they're creating barriers. And so at Voto Latino, not only do we talk about the importance of registering to vote, but we had an incredible year this last year. We registered over 617,000 registered voters. We identified 3.7 million low propensity voters, people who had sat it out either in 2016 or who had sat it out in 2018 or both. And with several partners, we were able to mobilize and engage them. One of the things that we learned using digital organizing and surveying, Hector, is that we found that 41% of people, as of June of last year, intended to vote early for Latino in the Latino community. That wasn't good enough at Voto Latino. We knew that there was a pandemic. We knew that people work hard. We knew that we have a tendency in the Latino community to wait hasta mañana. We needed to bank our vote. So we changed the way we talk to our audience. We went from 10 celebrity voices in 2016 to identifying over 267 surrogates and talking to them and giving them the information they needed that was state specific to encourage people to remind them that November 3rd was the deadline. We just got back our results and I couldn't be more pleased. Of the people we registered, 78% of them made it onto voting rolls. 77% of them voted. 83% of them voted early. That was through a large communications effort. In Georgia, to better understand the work, Stacey Abrams Fair Fight actually enlisted us to be part of the special election. They underwrote us to do their voter registration efforts. One of the things that we're so proud of, and Georgia's just a butt of an example of why it's important to register and to participate and talk to these young people all the time. What Stacey was saying is absolutely right. There's only two ways to increase voter participation. One is to register all the time. Two is to talk to our voters all the time. And in doing so at Voto Latino, I'll give you an idea of Georgia. In Georgia, this is in time for the Biden election, for the election against Biden, for the presidential election between Biden and Trump. Voto Latino, we registered 30,000 voters. Of those, 23,000 of the people that we registered voted. 9,642 of them were first-time voters. Biden won by a margin of 11,779. In Georgia, the people that Voto Latino registered and turned out performed 21% better than other Latinx geographics. So it was a constant conversation, talking to them, turning them into volunteers. And in that's part of the formula. But I will leave you with this. In the states that we are seeing voter suppression, it is also the states that young Latinos became the largest vote share of Latino voters. And they turned out in record number. In Arizona, young Latino voters outvoted their elders. In Nevada, they outvoted their elders. In Georgia, they outvoted their elders. In Pennsylvania, they outvoted the elders. Texas and North Carolina are on the precipice where the share of young Latinos will overpass their elders. The only state that we see where that is not the case anytime soon, and Hector, you could probably fill in that blank space, it's Florida. In fact, in Florida, it's the only state where older Latinos will continue aging in at a faster pace than Latinos turning 18 years old. And so if we were to take anything away from state legislators, is be as transparent as possible, welcome your audience and young people into the electoral process, talk to them all the time, remind them of their importance that a phone call makes, that an email makes, that knocking on the door makes, because what they want is an invitation to a space that oftentimes seems daunting, that sometimes doesn't seem that is welcoming. And the more that we can have these conversations and continue engaging them through voter registration, through issues they care about, and opening their door, not only do they perform, but they perform and they engage and they continue the conversation because they pay it forward into their own networks. Thank you, Hector.
And what an amazing example of hope, Maria Teresa, at a time when we are 10 years younger as a community, at a time when our democracy is under attack. I think that specific message that you mentioned about young Latinos, the present of our democracy, the role of young Latinos in our democracy, but also for the future. We know many of us in this call do this work every day, and we know that when we engage them and we do the work, they stay engaged. They participate, they vote, they work with their families, and they also run for office. They engage in this circle of political process. So I think that element of hope is so important for this conversation. And just like I asked you, Maria Teresa, about the internet and all this innovation, now I'm going to turn to our dear amiga, Lydia Camarillo from Southwest Voter Registration. Lydia, the perspective for you and your organization is from that the people that have been opening doors for a long time. You were one of the first organizations doing this work. You guys have been doing this even before the internet. So it's very important to contextualize that, just like Maria Teresa has been so innovating, opening doors, creating new ways of doing things. There are other organizations like Southwest Voter Registration that have been fighting for a very long time some horrible situations. And I want to also mention in that context that at the same time, NHCSL has been fighting against voter disenfranchisement with policy proposals that include automatic voter registration, early voting, same-day registration, vote by mail, election day holiday, and establishing due process standards before getting purged from voter rolls. So for you and your organization, what is the difference in the voter suppression bills that we're seeing right now and the fights that you at Southwest Voter Registration have witnessed for so many decades? And what are some of your recommendations? So what are the best strategies to fight these voter suppression bills, Lydia?
Well, first of all, thank you, Hector. I want to thank the National Hispanic Caucus of elected officials and Kenneth Romero, and of course, Senator Soto. And I want to also thank all of you on this panel. This is an amazing conversation, a conversation we must have. And I want to, of course, do a shout out to Stacey Abram for her work and all the work that we're doing. But I want to thank all of you who are online listening to us and helping us move forward. And especially I want to thank those of you who are on the ground, partnering with those with us and other groups around the country, trying to fight in 48 states where we have voter suppression. I also want to thank the Texas State Legislature for having the courage to walk out and stop HB House Bill 6, which is equal to Senate Bill 7, which is one of the most interesting voter suppression bill. The question you have asked is very simple. Are we moving forward? Do we have voter suppression? How is it different than 200 years ago, 100 years ago, or 20 years ago? It hasn't changed. Unfortunately, it hasn't changed. We move forward, we make some respectable gains, and then we find state legislators find a way, those legislators that do not want to see Latinos, Blacks, Asians, Asian Americans, Native Americans voting, and other communities of color taking part, finding ways to blocking our vote. From whether it was the poll tax in Texas, the voter ID that we fought and we sued, and won until the Shelby ruling, and then it was basically sent back to Congress. We will continue to see this absolute disturbing fight against democracy. America is in a time that it must make a decision about whether it will stand its ideals to democracy for what it says to the world. We are the nation of democracy, or are we going to be a country that does not care to promote democracy and becomes the villain that this country tries to stop in other nations around the world? That's our question today. But let me first tell you a little bit about Southwest Voter in case you do not know who we are. We are the first organization to work on this issue within the Latino community. In fact, Southwest Voter was modeled after the NAACP Voter Fund. In 1968, there was a conversation with Latino leaders who were lawyers, who were tired of the discrimination across the vote, whether it was in voting rights, education, housing, women's rights, anything that had to do with blocking. And when there were signs that said, no Mexicans, no dogs, no Blacks, those leaders were, many of them, LULAC members who were lawyers. They decided that they were going to start the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund. in 1968. Part of that conversation included Willie Velasquez, our founder. And what Willie was interested in was we can do the same thing that the NAACP voter fund did, and that's expand the electorate so that we can be at the table making choices about who governs us and how we are governed. As part of that conversation, Willie Velasquez invited Congressman John Lewis, who at the time was not a member of Congress, but an organizer himself, to teach us how to, in fact, expand the vote, register voters, and make sure that Latinos are part of the decision-making, not on the menu. I have to tell you that one of the most interesting conversations that Willie Velasquez had, who passed away in 1988, and Antonio Gonzalez, who is the former president, and Andy Hernandez, who followed Willie Velasquez as the president. I'm the next president once Antonio Gonzalez passed away. They received a call when Mandela was going to run for office. And the call was, can you help us with this election? And the one that received it was Andy Hernandez. And his point to those that called him was, you're going to win. What do you need from us? And their point was, we've never had an election. Come help us figure that out. So the Southwest voter model is simple. It's an empowerment model. How do Latinos decide about their future and who will govern them? And we have been registering voters since 1974 throughout the Southwest, including, and I know this is not the Southwest, but including Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, and other communities throughout the Southwest. We have registered 2.8 million Latinos. We will continue to work in a model that is an empowerment model so that when we leave, other communities can do the same. There are today many organizers who started with us who are now elected officials, who are making the policies that they need to do. We have trained 150,000 Latino leaders, including the most recent candidate training where Tracy Castillo was able to win an election with our first Latina training. We train co-ed for campaigns, but we decided it was time to do also just for Latinas since they face their own issues in San Antonio. And we have filed 210 voting rights lawsuits since we opened our doors. Willie Velasquez's point was, why are we not making progress if we're registering voters? And we realized that there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of jurisdictions around the country, particularly in Texas where we started, that were at-large systems not allowing our community, Latino voters, to elect their candidates of choice. So since then, we have transformed systems from at-large to single-member districts in Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona. And we're very proud to tell you that when New Mexico moved from a competitive state to a blue state, we registered that year 30,000 voters, the same in Colorado, the same in Arizona. We've been involved in those states. This last cycle, we were able to mobilize and work with 1 million voters in Arizona, Georgia, New Mexico, California, and of course, Texas. And our niche is to contact voters that are newly registered. We're happy to tell you that 500,000 new voters turned out to vote in Texas. But enough about Southwest Voter. You can follow us, check us, and work with us. Our strength is the people, the communities. We do not do anything without the power of the voters, the activists, the community. And that's how we organize, and we will continue to organize that way. To your point, there will continue to be organized efforts around the country as long as those who are in power do not want to relinquish their power. In this case, the Republican Party, and we're nonpartisan, but it is what it is. Facts are facts. The Republican Party has been very instrumental, very smart in organizing a tactic in 48 states to continue to diminish the advances that we had made. The Shelby ruling of 2013 gave them the opportunity. We saw the first opportunity immediately after the Shelby ruling was determined by the United States Supreme Court in 2013 in Pasadena, Texas, where they wanted to move the systems from district elections, where Latinos can elect candidates of their choice, as well as African Americans and Asian communities, back to at large. Luckily, Malda filed a lawsuit and you won. You're going to see some of that. We're about to enter the districting efforts, as you know. Mi Familia Vota and Voto Latino and Naleo and other groups. And Malda, of course, is the lawyer, and I'm the chair of the redistricting committee for Texas. Texas won 2 congressional seats. But I can tell you that we're going to do what we do every cycle, which is provide examples of maps where our community can elect candidates of choice. And the state of Texas, as long as it stays as it is, doesn't care about giving Latinos a voice, will give us the less representation. For example, let me say this. In 2010, I was the chair at that time. Malda were the lawyers, and there were 8 members who sued because Texas gained 4 congressional seats, new seats. I call it the lottery of the year because we got the most congressional seats. But in fact, the state, after we provided maps to testimony, organized communities around the state, decided that with the population growth of 4.3 million more people, 65% of which was Latino, and 90% which were Latino, Black, Asian, and other communities of color, they were going to take away from the 7 Latino majority seats that we had drawn in the previous redistricting cycle, that they were going to take away the 23rd, which is from San Antonio to El Paso, and retrogress it. And instead of 7 or gaining, nos quitaron. We started off with 6. So we go to court, we file a lawsuit, and we move from 7, 6 to 9. I expect that'll be the same case in this case. And so I'm very worried. It's basically about power that we are concerned with and very worried about. That the establishment that doesn't want to see people of color making choices about who will govern them, that's what this is all about. How do we win this? We must pass the reauthorize the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, pass the People's Act, continue to organize and speak to the voters and let the voters be part of the fight as well as the communities. I stand with all of you ready to fight for a democracy that we can all be proud of. Gracias.
Gracias, Lydia, for all that work and how critical the context of what we're discussing about gaining the political power that we deserve as a community, the issue of redistricting. That is an issue that is so critical, so important, and in our community must be involved. Before I ask my final question to the speakers, to Jorge, we're going to open it up after that for some questions. So you're welcome to submit your questions in the chat and also the specific question for any of our speakers. But let me pass it on to you, Jorge, in the advancement project. You guys have been working from the legal perspective on all these critical issues, and you are already taking on some of the approved voter suppression laws to court. Tell us about those cases and what is the strategy that you can share and what pitfalls should legislators in this call watch out for?
Sure. First, like everyone else stated, thank you for having me. It's truly a pleasure to be here with you all. We're in a critical time. Advancement Project is a national multiracial civil rights organization that's similar to Southwest Voter, is rooted in movement power. And in movement power, you need to listen to the people. You need to understand that people come first. And it's us listening to people and being a trusted voice in the community that led organizations like Mi Gente, like Blair, to come to us and have us file a lawsuit in Georgia. It's the same that happened in Florida against SB 202, where we represent Hispanic Federation, we represent Unidos, US, and we represent Puerto Latinx, as well as faith-based community. What we're seeing with these bills in all of these states is that they're going against advocacy efforts. They're going against tools that our community uses to engage voters. They're going against simple things like churches who corral and encourage voters to go vote and may even provide them with transportation to get. They're doing things to make it harder for in places where Latinos, for example, don't have a right to a non-English ballot because they're limited English proficiency to bring an assister of their choice or to have someone outside come in and assist them. So what we're doing at Advancement Project is whenever we bring a case, we bring it with a racial lens. It's not good enough to just say, this is a biased law. We're a nonpartisan organization. And what we highlight is the racial biases within these laws and the attacks that are happening to cultures with these over 400 voter suppression laws. And I start with the premise that we understand that voting is a learned experience. If voting is a learned experience, what happens when those over 1 million people that Lydia's organization has organized to go vote, and now they're trying to challenge their vote. They're trying to make sure that their vote doesn't count. This has an impact down the line, and it's a form of voter suppression that's plaguing our community. We know that Latinos have over 20 million eligible voters. We know that over 30 million naturalized citizens were eligible to vote for the first time in 2020. What this tells us is that America's fabric is the most diverse that it's ever been. And bringing it back to that learned experience, we need to make sure that America is true to its values and that everyone has an opportunity to cast a ballot free of harassment. And the only way we're going to do that is by calling stuff out and not just by lawsuits. One of our things is to work with organizers. We work year round to train individuals in every state that we're in to meet with who's in charge of the elections, whether that's a secretary of elections in some states, whether that's a board of elections in other states. So that way the community understands who has what discretion and how can we prevent mishaps from happening on election day. Because if you're waiting to election day to call a hotline, it's too late. You can never make somebody whole whose vote was suppressed. So what we need to do is learn from these things. And the way that we learn from these things is we educate, we organize, we mobilize, and we also make sure that our people vote. What we saw in 2020 with the voter turnout was at the cusp of George Floyd, at the cusp of the police violence. And certainly Latinos are no stranger to fatalities at the hands of law enforcement. We have places like Bakersfield, California, where you have certain law enforcement officers there who have murdered 3 people in a calendar year without missing 1 day of work. So what we see is that the community is organizing, they're protesting, but they're voting. And as was noted earlier, we're seeing that younger voters are engaging in the system. And it's truly these younger voters that bring us hope, because what that shows us is that these younger voters are able to engage their peers, are becoming the largest voting bloc, but that they understand what diversity means. And in understanding what diversity means and understanding what an inclusive America means for them, we've seen record turnout in 2020.
Thank you, Jorge. Let's see if we have some questions from the audience before I pass it on to you, Kenneth. And I want to take this opportunity, Kenneth, to congratulate you on your recent election as the chair of the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda. We look forward to collaborating with you. For those that are not familiar with NHLA, NHLA is the most important space in the nation for policy. It brings the 45 most important national Latino organizations in the nation. And it's a space of unity where we create the public policy agenda on behalf of the community. On every policy issue is presented to Congress, is presented to the White House, and then it's presented all over the nation. This is an amazing product, an amazing agenda that can also be used by legislators in the different states. But let me check if we have questions before I pass it on to you. Kenneth, it seems like we haven't received questions. Just a final note from my end. All of you legislators work on so many important issues. You are in the front lines fighting for better education, fighting on criminal justice issues, on immigration, on health, on democracy, on so many issues. But the issue of democracy, the issue of power, the issue of voter suppression that we have on the table right now is so important. So we need to make sure that we prioritize this issue, that we keep fighting, so we're not losing political power, and at the same time that we can advance all the agendas on the issues that we discuss. So thank you for joining us today. And with that, Kenneth, I pass it on to you, and thank you for the invitation to be here.
Thank you, Hector, and thank you for your unwavering leadership and for agreeing to moderate this important discussion. I want to thank each one of our panelists today, Ellen, Jorge, Leah, and Maria Teresa. You're all of you are an inspiration to us, to our community, but you also serve as a reminder of all the work that we have ahead. I can tell you that the National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators is committed to fight this wave of disenfranchisement bills and is more than committed to expand voting rights for all Americans. So I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank all of our attendees. And we hope that you will be able to join us in a future program. Thank you, everyone, so much. Have a great weekend.